young newlyweds come to pay their traditional wedding day respects at the eternal flame. They don't call it the Second World War here, they call it the Great Patriotic War. 20 million people died, and the memory of their sacrifice lives on in every Russian city. As a war leader, Stalin appealed directly to Russian patriotism. But more than one patriotic war was fought here. Then as now, the Soviet Union had many nations and many kinds of patriot.
Normandy, August 1944. Thousands of prisoners fell into Allied hands. They wore German uniform, but among them there were Russians, Georgians, Uzbeks and Tatars.
The volunteers, of course, consisted of as many nationalities as you have in the Soviet Union. And that number is very great. But as a whole, it worked very well. The common cause of overthrowing the regime of Stalin was sort of a glue which put everything together.
Zwischen den Hakenkreuzfahnen der ukrainische Löwe. Schon vor 25 Jahren war er Symbol des Freiheitskampfes gegen Moskau.
The Waffen-SS Galicia Division. Ukrainian patriots who preferred Hitler to Stalin. Berlin, April 1939. Adolf Hitler celebrates his 50th birthday. The Nazis had ruled Germany for 6 years. The Führer's army was strong. His ambition was boundless. That summer, Hitler sent a delegation to Moscow to negotiate a pact with the Russians. A young diplomat, Hans von Herwarth, traveled with the foreign minister, Ribbentrop. Now retired at his family castle near Nuremberg, von Herwarth remembers the result of the mission.
Ribbentrop went to the Kremlin. I went to the house of the ambassador because I had to keep contact with the headquarters of Hitler. And I still remember when I took leave from my ambassador, he told me many people are congratulating me that this agreement has been signed. But in reality, I achieved nothing because now Hitler has a possibility to start the Second World War, and we will end in an abyss that will be the end of Germany.
It may seem now that the pact signed here in the Kremlin was a marriage made in heaven between two monsters who deserved each other. But at the time, it was a tremendous shock. Western communists went to sleep one night in August, declaring Hitler to be a fascist beast, and woke next morning to find his head on their pillow. Millions of people in hitherto independent countries soon found that they were now Soviet citizens.
Poland disappeared from the map, divided up between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. This Soviet newsreel film was entitled The Liberation of Poland. The people of eastern Poland were mainly Ukrainians. The Red Invasion was presented as a chance to rejoin their ancient homeland. The celebrations were organized by the chief of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, in the capital, Lvov.
Within very few days, we saw the changes in the appearance even of the town. A lot of posters appeared, and a lot of propaganda was blared on the radio about the superiority of communist system, about the wisdom of the Communist Party, and about our liberation, that we join the paradise on earth.
The same thing happened to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and 2 Romanian provinces. Stalin annexed them under a secret protocol to his pact with Hitler. By May Day 1941, the pact had given him a precious 20 months of peace. As Stalin took the salute in Red Square, Dunkirk, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, All these events were in the past. His army had been retrained and re-equipped since the punishing purges of the 30s, but the experienced officers who'd been shot had still not been replaced. Hitler had said, "This colossal empire in the East is ripe for dissolution." Operation Barbarossa, June the 22nd, 1941. A Soviet border unit radioed an appeal. "We are being fired on. What shall we do?" The reply from Moscow, "You must be insane, and why is your signal not in code?" "1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Luftwaffe called it infanticide." Eight hours after the first attack, the Soviet people heard Foreign Minister Molotov speak.
Наше дело правое. Враг будет разбит. Победа будет за нами.
But in the Ukraine, the Germans were not automatically seen as enemies.
Salz und Brot als Zeichen der Gastfreundschaft.
The traditional greeting of bread and salt was offered by villagers sick of famine and terror. This is a German propaganda newsreel, but it did happen. A week after Barbarossa, the Germans arrived in Lvov.
June 41, the war broke out. Germans crossed the border. There was a sort of atmosphere of almost joy. The hope in the air, the evil will end, and some civilized people will come.
The city revealed a terrible secret.
There was a message on the radio from the Germans. It said, "Wives, mothers, brothers, sisters, come down to the prisons." I got to the entrance. I can't remember now which one. People were standing round on all sides of the gates. I could still see the bodies, though. They were lying in the courtyard, in rows.
Maria Siniva's husband was one of thousands imprisoned by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, during the 2 years of Soviet rule. In the panic which followed Barbarossa, the NKVD had butchered everyone. There were 3,500 dead.
I walked up and down the rows and I stopped to look at one of the dead bodies. It was covered by a blanket. I lifted the blanket and there he was. I'd found him. I don't know what had happened to him. But his face was all black. He had no eyes. Nothing there, and no nose.
After some time, the bodies were taken out and laid out in the yard, in the rows, hundreds, thousands of them. And there I found my brother-in-law. I wouldn't have recognized him. He was half naked. There were signs of wounds on the body, and the face was all in black and blue, and top. He was shot through the head. The hands were tied at the back with a piece of rope. And the only way I did recognize him when I saw the sock. He had the sock on his foot, one sock, colored in stripes. I recognized the knitting of my mother.
They put up these huge posters of Hitler everywhere. They said, "Hitler the Liberator." It sounds funny now, but then we really believed he might do something for our people, that we might get our freedom. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out like that.
Ukrainians and Russians soon learned the truth about the Nazis. In the wake of the regular army came the SS. They began to round up the Jews. Hitler dreamed of Lebensraum in the East, new living space for 100 million German supermen. It wasn't just the Jews that Hitler hated. He regarded the Slavs as subhuman too. As the German army took prisoners, Nazi newsreels paraded examples.
Hier eine kleine Auswahl besonders abschreckender Typen dieser bolschewistischen Untermenschen, die auf Befehl Stalins ganz Europa überschwemmen und Ordnung, Wohlstand und Kultur in Mord und Brand ersticken sollten.
In the first few months of war, the Nazis captured 4 million Red Army soldiers.
As the Soviet defenses collapsed, Stalin retreated to his dacha outside Moscow in a state of shock. For days he refused to speak to anyone. When he re-emerged, he had one new idea and one old one. The old idea was to shoot his unfortunate army commanders. The new idea was to appeal to Russians as patriots rather than communists.
We all got round the radio loudspeaker as Stalin's speech began. The first thing we heard was the clinking of a glass against a jug, and then water being poured into the glass. You could hear it so clearly. The water was poured out, Stalin took a gulp, and then he began to speak. Dear brothers and sisters, those first few words of his brought us so close to him, as though it was our own father speaking.
Stalin used every resource to encourage patriotic support for Soviet power and the Russian homeland. Here at the Holy Trinity Church in Moscow, services were permitted throughout the war. The Holy Trinity is next door to the factory where these women worked. As German bombers flew overhead, the workers got organized.
We slept here, lived right here at the factory. We never went home. When the air raid warnings went off, it was mostly at night. So a group of us from the Home Defence Brigade would run up onto the rooftop, and we'd all run round and just throw the fire bombs off. So basically you could say that the safety of the factory building was entirely in our hands. Of course we were frightened. These firebombs were blazing and throwing off sparks, and you had to go right up to them, grab them, run off with them and find somewhere to put them out. And those sparks could quite easily hit you, you know. They were flying off in all directions. So of course it was frightening. But after a while, we got very fierce. We'd pounce on the bombs, grab them by the tail and stick them straight into the water.
Well, nobody wants to die. Of course it was frightening, especially when you're only 17. But you can get used to anything, can't you? By the end of the war, we were all quite fearless.
But in that first October, panic gripped the capital. With the Germans nearing Moscow, the party organized groups of women to dig trenches to stop the German advance. The remains of the women's work are still visible today in the country outside the city. Thousands of Muscovites were fleeing in terror, and the government was evacuated. Those who stayed were put to work.
We dug anti-tank trenches. They were huge, about 8 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Big as that. It was mostly us women who did the work. It was hard labor. We had to light fires to warm the earth up before we could dig into it. The earth was frozen solid on top, but deeper down it wasn't so hard.
It was freezing cold. There was a terrible frost, but you had to keep digging. They made us dig. We had to do it, and we did. We kept digging.
They were bombing us all the time, and the Germans dropped leaflets on us. They said, "Surrender, Moscow is kaput." We didn't believe it.
40% of the population of the empire was now under German occupation. On the frosty night of November the 6th, the Moscow Party faithful gathered in the metro. Stalin and his general staff were the only members of the government left in the capital.
I don't know how the roof didn't fall in. There was such an ovation. People clapping and stamping their feet for ages, so overjoyed that the leader of our country, the leader of our party, had come. Stalin was here at such a difficult time. He was a very busy man. His time was very precious. He pulled out his pocket watch. It was like a little ball, and held it up by its chain. He didn't say a word, just held it there. And everybody immediately understood that there was no time to waste. A deathly silence fell in the hall, as if there wasn't a soul there. That's how quiet it was.
The next day was the anniversary of the revolution. Stalin spoke to the soldiers.
На вас смотрят все народы Европы, временно подпавшие под иго немецкой тирании, как на своих освободителей. Великая освободительная миссия выпала на вашу долю. Будьте же достойны этой миссии. За полный разгром немецких захватчиков, смерть немецким оккупантам. Да здравствует наша славная Родина, ее свобода, ее независимость. Под знаменем Ленина вперед к победе!
They marched straight to the front. In the coldest winter for years, these men denied Hitler his entrance into Moscow. "300 armaments factories were now under German occupation. To modernize and extend its tank force, the Soviet government had to fight on an industrial front too. The planned economy had failed to get modern tank designs produced quickly enough. And as the Germans advanced, the workers at the Kirov arms factory in Leningrad were enlisted in a bold and desperate scheme.
The factories had been run in a military spirit for years. All those shock workers, storming fortresses, opening new production fronts. Now the command economy was face to face with a real war. And it turned out that though the planners were not very good at planning, they were remarkably good at improvisation.
Leningrad was under fierce bombardment as the Germans threw a siege around the city. As winter closed in, there was no fuel, no electricity. Strict rationing was in force. People were beginning to die.
I lost my entire family's ration cards. I sobbed, I screamed, I howled, I ran round and round, I jumped on a tram and ran up and down it screaming, "Give me my ration cards, give them back." I realized, even though I was only 14, that my family would starve. We were all going to die. And so we really were overjoyed to be evacuated to Chelyabinsk.
Alexandra Frolova was one of 10 million people who made the journey east. All over Russia and the Ukraine, whole factories were loaded onto trains to Siberia and Central Asia. In Chelyabinsk, the Leningraders built the guns and tanks to beat Hitler. I started at the factory on the 16th of January 1942. You could see people standing in the snow and frost, working in the open air. Filthy. Tanks everywhere. I just can't begin to tell you how dreadful it all was. I felt the horror and fear welling up inside me, all over again. There really was a war going on. They took me to the shop to start work. Lathes, lifting cranes, people running around, desperate, worried, sad. And who were they, these people? Children. Nearly all the workers were underage children or old women. If the front needs it, we'll make it. The workers renamed their new home. Instead of Chelyabinsk, they called it Tankograd. Here they built the celebrated and revolutionary tank called the T-34. The Chelyabinsk factory had built tractors before the war. Now it builds tractors again. The workers from Leningrad made the changeover.
Tractors are just like tanks. They've got the same diesel engine, the same transmission, caterpillar tracks and lots of other similar features. If it's got no armour plating, it's a tractor. Put a machine gun on top and it's a tank. There are differences, of course, but generally speaking they're very similar. So we started to make tanks. At the beginning we were producing 3 tanks a day. By the end of the war, when the time came to take Berlin, we were making up to 35 tanks a day. That's a whole tank battalion every single day.
The people from Leningrad who escaped to Chelyabinsk were the lucky ones. The workers they left behind were dying. Hitler regarded Leningrad as the birthplace of Bolshevism. He sentenced the city to death. By the end, 630,000 people would die of cold and starvation. The siege around the northern capital was to last nearly 900 days. In the autumn of 1942, the British Prime Minister went to Russia to meet his allies.
Whatever our sufferings, whatever our toils, we will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground, until the memory only of it remains as an example and a warning for future time.
As he entered, the Prime Minister gave his famous V sign for the cameraman's benefit.
Behind the smiles, their alliance was acrimonious. Winston Churchill told Stalin there would be no second front in France to relieve the Red Army. And Hitler was throwing massive forces against the city which bore Stalin's name. Stalingrad fought for 5 long months from the autumn of 1942. Men battled for every street, every house, every brick. Stalin gave the order, not a step back. The city was in ruins, but Stalingrad was a splendid and symbolic victory for the Red Armed Forces, who now included a group of women fighting in the front line.
We were taken in to meet the commander. He asked, "Well, have you brought me any pilots?" They said, "Yes, here they are." "Strange," he said, "I don't see any pilots in here." I felt terrible. But on the next day, they sent me out into action. They transferred me onto fighter bombers, the Stormovik. The Stormovik is not a plane for ladies. It's armor-plated. It can take up to 600 kilos of bombs, and it carries 2 machine guns.
The bomber designer Tupolev spent his war making aeroplanes in a Stalinist prison. One of thousands of scientists like engineer Meir Mordukovich still in the camps as a result of the purges.
During the war in 1943, my prison sentence came to an end. A secret police chief came to see me. He said, "We can't let you go, Stalin's orders. While there's a war on, no release for prisoners guilty of your offense. When you're doing work you love, it's not so hard. You can sit over it all night long and still not get tired of it." So everybody worked with a will. And of course we realized we were working for the good of our country. The fact that we'd been arrested and put in prison didn't put us off. We were still patriots.
Stalin told the American ambassador, "We are under no illusion that they are fighting for us. They are fighting for Mother Russia." The greatest tank battle in history. Hitler had said, "The victory at Kursk must shine like a beacon to the world." He lost. It was the summer of 1943, the turning point. In the occupied areas, the party stepped up the organization of partisan bands among the civilian population. Soviet partisans were trained in sabotage and based in woodland hideouts. Germans killed thousands in reprisal. Hitler said, "The struggle against the partisans in the entire East is a life and death struggle in which one side or the other must be exterminated." The partisans became legendary for their valor and patriotism. But the woods of Belorussia and the Ukraine held another kind of partisan, another kind of patriot.
The Ukrainian insurgent army formed. I was one of the founders. It was conspiratorial, underground. But then open clashes with the Reds began. They started it. As the front got closer, Red partisans started to encroach on our territory. They attacked us. I was given the task of defending the borders of the forest. All our units moved into action against the Soviet troops. As we saw it, they were occupying our country.
Greece was arrested and sent to the camps. The tide was turning. The Red Army were welcomed in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov as liberators. Their first job was to smoke out the headquarters of the Nazi authorities which had held the town for 2 years. SS and Gestapo officers were put on public trial. Among the accused was Mikhail Bulanov, a Ukrainian collaborator. Bulanov confessed to taking part in the mass murder of women and children at the city hospital. 3 Nazis were sentenced to death alongside Bulanov, the collaborator. They had been responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of citizens. The Soviet liberation swept on. In the spring of 1944, the Red Army reached the Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Tatars had lived under German occupation for 2 years. German officers had courted the support of the Muslim population.
The population was very, very friendly because one of our first measures was to reopen the mosques, the Islamic churches, so to speak. That, of course, won the sympathy of the local population. The Tatars, of course, had to pay very heavily for their friendly attitude towards us.
The Crimean port of Sebastopol was liberated on May the 9th, 1944, after a ferocious battle. Nazi rule was over. The search for collaborators began. Everywhere in the south, liberation was followed by partisans coming down out of the hills to their newly liberated towns and villages. Even heroes like these fell under suspicion. This family of Tatars from the Crimea survived a terrible retribution.
It was the middle of the night. About 3 a.m. An officer and 2 soldiers came in. They gave us 15 minutes, that's all. Take only what you can carry, they said. You're to be exiled from the territory of the Crimea. We were shaking from head to foot with fear. We'd seen how the Germans threw live people, Jews and Crimeans, down the well. So when our own soldiers came, we were in such a state. Exile? Where to? We'll all be shot. I was saying, I'll take this with me. My sister threw it aside. She said, what are you taking that for? You're going to your death. But maybe we won't die, I said. We took whatever we could manage. There were only us women, no men, except the old ones. They loaded us all into wagons, cattle wagons.
Abyakimova and the entire Crimean Tatar nation were declared guilty of collaboration. Thousands died in the cattle wagons which expelled them from the Crimea to Siberia and Central Asia.
Уже 46 лет почти.
It's almost 46 years ago now, but I can still remember all the little sacks, the bundles, the packages which had been tied up in the Crimea. People never unpacked them. Everybody was hoping we'd be sent back.
Люди их не развязывали.
Every day we heard news, I don't know. Maybe they made it up because they wanted to believe it. But the news was always that we'd be going home. Tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow.
Что вот завтра нас увезут обратно, послезавтра.
By my calculations, 20,000 railway wagons were tied up for months, at a time when every effort was needed for fighting total war. But waste and cruelty combined were the hallmarks of high Stalinism. Just as individuals became unpersons in the terror of the 1930s, so now whole countries became unnations. The Crimean Tatars were written out of the history books. It was as though they had never existed.
A 1.5 million people from 8 small nations suffered the same punishment. These are the Kalmyk people who lived on the shores of the Caspian Sea. All the women and children were sent to Siberia. Their men were thrown out of the army. Lenin once said, "Kalmyk brothers, the entire past of your people is an uninterrupted chain of suffering." November 1944, the anniversary of the revolution, at the end of a year when almost all the empire was liberated. Victory was approaching. But several million men and women were in the hands of the Germans. Stalin regarded them all as traitors and dead men. His own son, Yakov, had died a prisoner of war. Soviet prisoners of war starved and died in Nazi camps. Millions were put to work or served in the German army. Some volunteered, some were forced. All were deemed traitors. Heroism in the field was no defense against the charge.
They shot at me again and again. My plane caught fire. I came round. I was falling out of the sky without a parachute. I lay on the ground. There was a German standing over me. He put his boot on my chest. But you know, the physical pain wasn't as bad as the emotional horror I felt. The horror that I was in the hands of the fascists. Better if they killed me. That's how I felt. They tried to get me up, but I kept falling. My leg was broken, my arm was broken, my legs were all burnt, my arms, my face all burnt.
In January 1945, Timofeeva's prisoner of war camp was liberated by the Red Army. Still badly injured, she was interrogated on suspicion of spying.
It had been going on for 10 days, and that was it. I cracked. I ran upstairs. There was a guard, a soldier. He ran after me shouting, "Stop, or I'll shoot," but I ran on. I was out of my mind completely. I ran into the office of the major there and started screaming, "Shoot me, I can't stand it any longer. What happened to Soviet power? What's happened to it?"
One group of soldiers hoped to use the war to overthrow the injustice of Stalinism. The Russian Liberation Army was led by an idealistic Soviet captive, General Andrei Vlasov. His men wore the red, white and blue of pre-revolutionary Russia, but they were part of the German army.
it was perhaps the last chance with arms to overthrow that terrible regime. Perhaps it was an illusion to consider ourselves as a independent army that will decide its own strategy and whatnot. Of course, we depended on the Germans, but there was no sense of collaborating with Germans. It was anti-Soviet and pro-Russian. It sounds like being very naive nowadays, but we hoped, some of us hoped, that this war cannot stop as where it stopped, because it was only half of the evil was destroyed.
The Red Army was 15 miles east of Berlin when the Führer emerged from his bunker to make his last public appearance with boys of the Hitler Youth. It was his 56th birthday, April the 20th, 1945. Half a million Red soldiers poured into the city. The Soviet propagandist Ilya Ehrenburg urged the troops on. All the trenches, graves and ravines filled with the corpses of innocents are advancing on Berlin. The dead are knocking at the doors. Whirl round in circles and burn and howl in your deathly agony. The hour of revenge has struck. As the red flag flew, the Führer and his new bride, Eva Braun, killed themselves. In Moscow, Sergeant Egorova was on telephone duty.
The sergeant major said, "What's up? A new raid?" "The war's over," I said. "Don't be stupid." "No, the war's over." And I ran off to the unit commander. The sergeant major was still standing there, wondering whether it was all true or if I'd gone mad. The commander came out. "What's happened?" he asked. I told him, "Comrade Captain, the war's over." All the girls started to screech. They flew towards me, hugged me, kissed each other, hugged each other, shouted, wept. That was how the war ended.
The 9th of May, 1945, Victory Day. It would be many years before the true horror of their wartime losses was revealed. After 1812, Russian soldiers presented the captured standards of Napoleon's army to the victorious Tsar Alexander I. In June 1945, Stalin stood in the pouring rain on the roof of Lenin's mausoleum as the Red Army threw the standards of the Wehrmacht at his feet. Among the returning heroes were Chuikov, victor of Stalingrad, Konev, first man into Berlin, Meretskov, savior of Leningrad. Stalin, generalissimo, his authority and prestige immeasurably swollen by victory. $20 million people had died. Soviet veterans take an enduring pride in the honor and achievement of their war against fascism. But in the Soviet Union, as everywhere in Europe, the survivors hoped for a new world.
Some people believe the victory over Hitler in some way redeems Stalin's barbarity. Many think he showed real talent as a war leader. I don't find either argument particularly helpful. The important thing is the Soviet people showed astonishing courage in the prosecution of their great patriotic war, and they were rewarded with what? With more of the same. For though the Soviet people won the war, the victor was Stalinism.
3 months before the war ended, Stalin played host to a crucial summit in the Crimean town of Yalta. At Yalta, the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill, met to negotiate the shape of post-war Europe. Churchill asked Stalin privately what he should do about the Russian prisoners still held in the West. The official record says Marshal Stalin hoped they could be sent to Russia as quickly as possible. The agreement was kept secret. There were 100,000 Russian prisoners in Allied hands. Nearly 20,000 of them, Cossacks who had fought on the wrong side, were held in this camp in Austria. Some were not Soviet citizens at all, but émigrés. The British Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, said, "We cannot afford to be sentimental about this." British troops persuaded the Cossacks to hand in their guns. When the Cossacks realized what was happening, there were suicides. Men shot their families. Mothers drowned their babies. Allied troops put thousands onto trains and handed them over to the Red Army.
Those nice-looking American chaps, you know, with big sticks chasing these wretched people to the cars. And they simply, just like children, they didn't understand what they were doing. Well, grim faces, everything lost, you know. I have no will to do something about it, no will to fight back. There's no longer any fighting spirit, even for your survival, left. And they were herded just like a herd of sheep. And this is what they looked like.
And many loyal Soviet prisoners of war fared little better.
When
they started organizing our departure, we all rejoiced. The war was over. We were going home. The Americans gave all the Soviet troops a little suitcase with clean linen, but we didn't get to keep them, of course. There was a bridge we had to walk over. We saw secret police troops standing on the other side. Some men threw themselves into the water. Some tried to stop them and said, "Take what you've got with you." We arrived. They began to unload us. An escort was waiting. We climbed off our train. We saw what was written on the side. Traitors to the homeland.
Trushkov was accused of spying. He got 10 years. The victory was so great, its price so terrible. There were happy endings. Fighter pilot Anna Timofeeva was rehabilitated.
My mother was told I'd been killed in action, and I was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. And it was only in 1965 that the Supreme Soviet finally let me have my gold medal. Hero of the Soviet Union.